The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city park. Ethan Harper, a successful businessman, was taking his usual evening walk, hoping to clear his mind after a long day of meetings and decisions that never seemed to end. The park was serene, with only the distant sound of children's laughter echoing in the background. As he passed by a cluster of trees, he noticed something out of place. A small figure sitting alone on a bench, shoulders hunched, quietly sobbing. Ethan's heart tightened. The sight of a child crying alone stirred something deep within him. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle the boy. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, crouching down to meet the child's eye level. "Are you okay? Where's your mom?" The boy, who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks. His big, brown eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. I don't know," the boy stammered, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "I can't find her." Ethan felt a pang of empathy. He remembered getting lost as a child once. How terrifying it was to feel so small and alone in a world that suddenly seemed too big. "What's your name?" Ethan asked gently, trying to calm the boy. "Jacob," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Okay, Jacob," Ethan said, offering a reassuring smile. "We'll find your mom, I promise. Let's start by going to the police station, okay? They'll know what to do." Jacob nodded, his small hand reaching out to grasp Ethan's. The simple gesture filled Ethan with a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in a long time. As they walked through the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something oddly familiar about the boy. The thought lingered in the back of his mind, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the immediate task of helping Jacob. They reached the police station, where an officer welcomed them warmly. While waiting for news, Ethan stayed by Jacob's side, distracting him with stories about his own childhood adventures. The boy listened intently, his tears finally beginning to dry. As they sat there, something clicked in Ethan's mind. Jacob's eyes, his mannerisms, even the way he fidgeted with his shirt. It all reminded him of someone he once knew. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted when a female officer approached them. "We've located Jacob's mother," she announced. "She's in the hospital, but she's very sick." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Hospital? Sick?" The words echoed in his mind as a sense of dread began to settle in his chest. "Do you know what's wrong with her?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and urgency. "She's been admitted with a serious condition. I can take you both to see her," the officer offered. Ethan looked at Jacob, whose eyes were wide with worry. "Let's go see your mom," he said, squeezing the boy's hand gently. Jacob nodded, his small fingers tightening around Ethan's. The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled only with the hum of the car engine and the racing thoughts in Ethan's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to confront something significant, something that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. When they arrived, the sterile smell of the hospital and the harsh fluorescent lights made everything feel surreal. As they walked down the hallway, the sense of familiarity grew stronger. It wasn't until they reached the room and Ethan saw the woman lying in the hospital bed that his world tilted on its axis. There, pale and fragile, was Emily, his Emily, the woman he had loved more than anything during his college years. The woman who had vanished from his life without a trace. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. The years had changed her, but there was no mistaking it. This was the same Emily who had once been the center of his world. And now, she was lying there so still, so vulnerable. The realization hit him like a wave. Jacob was her son. Her son. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the years that had passed, wondering what had happened, and why she had never reached out to him. Jacob, oblivious to Ethan's turmoil, rushed to his mother's side, climbing onto the bed and gently touching her hand. "Mommy, I found you," he whispered, his voice filled with both relief and fear. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Jacob, a weak smile spread across her face, but when her gaze shifted to Ethan, her expression froze in shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of lost years and unresolved feelings. "Ethan," Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried all the emotion of their shared past. Ethan stepped closer, his heart in his throat. "Emily, He stopped, unable to find the right words. What do you say to someone you thought you'd lost forever? What do you say when you realize that the love of your life has been living a life without you, with a son who could have been yours?" The emotional storm that swirled inside him was overwhelming, but one thing was clear. Ethan wasn't going to lose her again, not without a fight. He had found them, and now he was determined to do whatever it took to make things right. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the small hospital room, a sharp contrast to the flood of memories that overwhelmed Ethan. He stood at the threshold, unable to move, as Emily's eyes locked onto his. The years apart had etched faint lines on her face, and the light in her once vibrant eyes had dimmed, but she was still unmistakably the woman he had loved. Emily struggled to sit up, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch Jacob's hair. The boy nestled closer to her, his small frame curled protectively against his mother's side. "Ethan," she whispered again, as if saying his name would somehow make him disappear or perhaps bring him back to her. Her voice was weak, but it carried a depth of emotion that shook Ethan to his core. "I can't believe it's you," Ethan finally managed to say, stepping into the room, his voice thick with emotion. After all these years, Emily swallowed hard, trying to gather her strength. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said softly, her eyes flickering between Ethan and Jacob. "I never wanted this." "Emily," Ethan interrupted gently, taking another step closer. "What happened? Where did you go? Why didn't you tell me about Jacob?" His questions spilled out in a rush, years of confusion and hurt bubbling to the surface. He had so many things he wanted to ask, so many things he needed to understand. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a sadness in her gaze that made Ethan's heart ache. "It's a long story, Ethan, one I wasn't sure I'd ever get to tell you." She looked down at Jacob, her hand gently brushing his hair. "But first, you need to know. Jacob is my son. He's my whole world now." Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. The boy who had seemed so familiar was indeed a piece of Emily, a piece of the life they might have had together. He crouched down beside the bed, his eyes level with Emily's. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Tell me everything. I want to understand." Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap where her hands lay clasped together. "After college, everything changed," she began slowly. "You were so focused on your career, on building your future, and I didn't want to hold you back. I knew how important it was to you to succeed, and I started to feel like I was just in the way. So, I made a decision. I left." Ethan's heart sank as he listened, the memories of their last days together flooding back. He remembered how distant she had become, how she had slowly pulled away from him without any explanation. "You just disappeared," he murmured, his voice laced with the pain of those lost years. "I searched for you, Emily. I tried to find you, but it was like you vanished into thin air." "I thought it was the right thing to do," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I thought if I left, you could focus on your dreams without any distractions. But it wasn't easy. Life wasn't easy without you." She paused, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Then, I found out I was pregnant. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was scared, Ethan. I didn't think you'd want to be tied down, not with everything you were working for." Ethan felt a rush of emotions. Anger, regret, sadness, all competing for dominance. He wanted to tell her how wrong she had been, how he would have chosen her and their child over any career, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "You should have told me," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I would have been there for you, for both of you." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks, and she squeezed his hand in return. "I know that now," she whispered. "But back then, I was so lost, so afraid. I tried to make a life for myself and Jacob, but it wasn't easy. We've been through so much, and now I'm here, and I don't know what's going to happen to us." Ethan's heart ached as he looked at Emily, so fragile and vulnerable. The thought of her suffering alone all these years, raising Jacob without any support, filled him with a deep sense of regret. He glanced at Jacob, who was listening quietly, his wide eyes filled with confusion and worry. "You're not alone anymore," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "I'm here now, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you or Jacob. We'll figure this out together." Emily looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. "But Ethan, my illness, it's serious. I don't know if I'll get better." Ethan felt a surge of determination. "We'll get you the best care," he insisted. "I don't care what it takes. You're not going to go through this alone. I'm here, Emily. I'm here for you and Jacob." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was the same love and resolve that had drawn her to him so many years ago. Slowly, she nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Ethan replied gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for, and I'm not going to waste a single moment. We're in this together now." Jacob, sensing the emotional shift between his mother and the man he barely knew, looked up at Ethan with a tentative smile. "Are you going to stay with us?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. Ethan smiled back, his heart swelling with affection for the boy. "Yes, Jacob," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "I'm going to stay with you and your mom. We're going to be a family." In that moment, as the three of them sat together in the quiet hospital room, the past began to heal, and a new future started to take shape. A future filled with hope, love, and the promise of a second chance. The ride back to Emily's small apartment was quiet, filled only with the sound of the car's engine and the soft breathing of Jacob, who had fallen asleep in the back seat. Ethan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the thought of all the years he had missed. But it wasn't just Jacob he regretted losing. It was Emily, too. The woman who had once been the love of his life, now sitting beside him, fragile and fading. The apartment complex was modest, worn down by time, a far cry from the life Ethan had built for himself. He parked the car and helped Emily out, her body weak and unsteady. She smiled at him, a shadow of the vibrant woman she had once been, and it took all of Ethan's strength not to break down right there. Inside, the apartment was small but clean, filled with the simple necessities of life. It was clear that Emily had done her best with what little she had. A few framed photos lined the shelves, pictures of Jacob as a baby, smiling despite the obvious lack of extravagance in their surroundings. Ethan's eyes lingered on one particular photo of Emily holding a newborn Jacob, her face glowing with a bittersweet joy. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again," Emily said softly, her voice pulling Ethan back to the present. She was sitting on the worn-out sofa, her hands folded in her lap as she looked up at him. "I thought I'd lost you for good." Ethan sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but not too close to overwhelm her. "I never stopped looking for you," he admitted, his voice low. "Even after I gave up hope of finding you, I never stopped thinking about you." Emily sighed, a mixture of sadness and relief in her expression. "I wanted to reach out so many times, but I was scared that you'd moved on, that you wouldn't want to be part of this life. Our life." Ethan took her hand in his, feeling the frailty of her fingers, the coolness of her skin. "You were wrong, Emily. I would have given anything to be with you and Jacob. I would have been there in a heartbeat." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and she squeezed his hand, the years of pain and regret etched into her face. "I was so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered. "You were doing amazing things, and I didn't want to hold you back. I thought leaving was the best thing for you." Ethan shook his head, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "You were never holding me back, Emily. You were the reason I worked so hard. You were my future, my everything, and when you left, I didn't know how to move on." For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. The weight of the years apart, of the missed opportunities and the love they had lost, hung between them like a veil. But underneath it all, there was still something there, something that had never truly faded. "Do you remember the day we met?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice filled with a nostalgic warmth. "It was at that coffee shop near campus. You were so focused on your books, and I accidentally spilled my coffee all over your notes." Ethan chuckled, the memory surfacing with surprising clarity. "You were so embarrassed. I thought you were going to run out of the shop and never come back. But instead, you offered to rewrite all my notes." Emily smiled, a genuine, soft smile that lit up her tired face. "And you didn't even care about the notes. You just wanted an excuse to ask me out. It worked, didn't it?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with fondness. "You said yes." "I said yes," Emily echoed, her smile fading slightly as the reality of their situation settled back in. "We had so many dreams back then. We were going to travel the world, remember? We talked about all the places we wanted to see. Paris, Rome, the beaches of Greece." Ethan nodded, the dreams they had shared coming back to him in vivid detail. "I remember," he said quietly. "We thought we had all the time in the world. But life doesn't always go the way we plan, does it?" Emily's voice was tinged with regret, her gaze distant as she looked out the window. "We make choices, and sometimes they take us down paths we never expected." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Emily, I don't care about the past anymore. What matters is now. We're here, together, and I'm not going to let you go again. We can still have those dreams. Maybe not the way we imagined, but we can make new ones." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Do you really think we can?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that reached his eyes. "I know we can. We have Jacob. We have each other, and that's more than enough to start again." As the words hung in the air, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many things to work through, so many challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. With Emily, with Jacob, ready to face whatever the future held. And in that moment, as the city lights twinkled outside the window, the memories of a lost love began to heal, paving the way for the life they were about to build together. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Emily's apartment, casting a warm glow over the small living room. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched Jacob play with a set of toy cars on the floor. The boy was lost in his own world, his laughter filling the space with a lightness that seemed to momentarily banish the heaviness in Ethan's heart. Emily had fallen asleep shortly after they returned from the hospital, exhaustion overtaking her frail body. Ethan had insisted on staying the night, unwilling to leave her alone in such a vulnerable state. Now, as the sun rose higher in the sky, he knew it was time to confront the reality of their situation. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Emily emerged, her steps slow and unsteady. She looked pale, her eyes heavy with fatigue, but there was a determination in her expression that Ethan hadn't seen in years. She offered him a small, tired smile as she walked over to join him at the table. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from sleep. "Morning," Ethan replied, his concern evident in his tone. "How are you feeling?" Emily shrugged, trying to downplay the pain she was in. "I've had better days," she admitted, reaching for his hand across the table. "But I've had worse too." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "We need to talk about what's next," he said, his voice steady but filled with unspoken fear. "About your treatment, about Jacob, about us." Emily nodded, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. "I know," she said. "But Ethan, I need you to understand. I'm scared, not just for myself, but for Jacob. If something happens to me, I don't know what will happen to him." Ethan's heart tightened at the thought, and he shook his head firmly. "Nothing is going to happen to you, Emily. We're going to get you the best care, the best doctors. Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Emily smiled sadly, her hand tightening around his. "I want to believe that," she said quietly. "But the truth is, I don't know how much time I have left, and I can't keep pretending that everything is going to be okay when it might not be." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. "Then let me help you," he urged, his voice thick with emotion. "Let me take care of you and Jacob. We'll figure it out together." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I never wanted to be a burden to you, Ethan," she whispered. You have your own life, your own responsibilities. I can't ask you to give that up for us. You're not asking, Ethan replied, his voice firm. I'm offering. I want to be here for you, for Jacob. I've already lost so much time. I'm not going to lose anymore. For a moment, Emily was silent, her gaze dropping to the table as she struggled with the enormity of what he was saying. She knew Ethan meant every word, but the fear of dragging him in her world of uncertainty and pain was overwhelming. What if things don't get better? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I don't make it? Ethan reached out, lifting her chin so that their eyes met. Then we'll make the most of the time we have, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. But I refuse to believe that it's too late. We found each other again. Emily, that has to mean something. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and she bit her lip to keep them from spilling over. She had spent so long being strong, so long carrying the weight of her decisions alone. Now, faced with Ethan's unwavering support, she felt a part of herself beginning to break free, a part she had buried deep inside, afraid to let anyone see. Okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. Okay, Ethan, I'll let you help, but you have to promise me something. Anything, Ethan replied, his heart pounding in his chest. If the worst happens, Emily said, her voice cracking with emotion, you'll take care of Jacob. You'll make sure he's safe, that he has a good life. Ethan's throat tightened, and he nodded, his voice thick with the weight of his promise. I will, Emily. I swear to you. I'll take care of him like he's my own. Emily let out a shaky breath, a mixture of relief and sorrow washing over her. She had spent so many years fearing this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. Ethan was here, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have to carry the burden by herself. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for coming back into our lives. Ethan leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I never really left, he murmured. I was just waiting for you to find me again. As they sat there, hand in hand, the sunlight streaming through the window, there was a sense of quiet hope in the air, a hope that, despite the challenges ahead, they could face them together. The road wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, they were ready to walk it side by side. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of caring for Emily and Jacob became Ethan's new normal. He arranged for the best doctors to assess Emily's condition, using his resources and connections to ensure she received the highest level of care. Despite the mounting medical bills, Ethan didn't hesitate. His focus was solely on Emily's recovery and Jacob's well-being. But it wasn't just about managing the present. The past, with all its unresolved emotions and buried pain, loomed over them like a shadow that refused to fade. Ethan knew that sooner or later, they would have to face it. One evening, after putting Jacob to bed, Ethan found Emily sitting by the window in the dimly lit living room. The moonlight cast a soft glow on her face, accentuating the weariness in her eyes. She looked fragile, as if a gust of wind could shatter her, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. Ethan approached her, his footsteps soft on the carpet. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, attempting a lightness in his tone that neither of them truly felt. Emily smiled faintly, but her gaze remained fixed on the night sky. "Just thinking about how everything turned out," she replied, her voice tinged with melancholy. "I've been trying to make sense of it all, how we ended up here." Ethan sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but careful not to invade her space. "I think about that too," he admitted. "I think about the choices we made, the paths we took, and I wonder if we could have done things differently." Emily sighed, her breath fogging up the glass. "Maybe," she said softly, "but wondering doesn't change anything, does it? We're here now, and we have to deal with the reality in front of us." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "But that doesn't mean we can't talk about it," he said gently. "We never really talked about why you left, Emily. We never got closure." Emily looked down at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. "I was scared," she confessed, her voice trembling with the admission. "I was scared that I wasn't enough for you, that you'd eventually realize you could do better. I didn't want to be the one holding you back." "You were never holding me back," Ethan said, his voice filled with conviction. I was chasing my dreams, yes, but you were always a part of those dreams. Losing you, it was like losing a piece of myself. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving, she whispered. I thought I was setting you free. But all I did was create this huge void in both our lives. And then, when I found out about Jacob, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to disrupt your life, especially after you had already moved on. Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he listened to her, realizing just how much pain she had carried alone all these years. Emily, he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. You never disrupted my life. You were my life. I would have given up everything to be with you and Jacob. I just wish you had told me, that you had trusted me enough to stay. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was so afraid of what might happen if I stayed. I didn't want to be the reason you gave up your dreams. But now I see that leaving was the biggest mistake I ever made. Ethan's heart ached as he watched her struggle with the weight of her regrets. He wanted to reach out, to hold her and tell her that everything would be okay, but he knew that wasn't enough. They had to confront the past head-on if they were going to have any chance at a future together. We can't change what happened, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But we can decide what happens next. We could choose to move forward, to build something new out of the pieces we have left. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Do you really think we can? She asked, her voice trembling with vulnerability. Ethan nodded, his gaze unwavering. I do, he said firmly. We've been given a second chance, Emily. It's not going to be easy, and we'll have to face a lot of challenges, but we can do it. Together. Emily let out a shaky breath, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing as she allowed herself to believe in his words. I want to believe that, she said softly. I want to believe that we can find happiness again, that we can give Jacob the life he deserves. We can, Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet determination. But we have to start by forgiving ourselves, by letting go of the past and focusing on what we have now. We have each other, we have Jacob, and that's enough. Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her tired face. Thank you, Ethan, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for being here, for not giving up on us. Ethan leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I could never give up on you, he murmured. You're worth fighting for, Emily. You always have been. As they sat there in the quiet of the night, hand in hand, a sense of peace began to settle over them. The past was still there, with all its pain and regrets, but it no longer held them captive. They had confronted it, faced it together, and now they were ready to move forward, ready to build a future that was filled with hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. The road ahead would be difficult. There was no denying that. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan and Emily felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other and create the life they had once dreamed of, a life where love could heal the deepest wounds and pave the way for a brighter tomorrow. The days that followed were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, medical tests, and careful planning. Ethan stayed by Emily's side through it all, his unwavering support, giving her strength she didn't know she still had. Every day, he balanced his work with the demands of her care, ensuring that Jacob was never left out or forgotten. It was exhausting, but Ethan didn't complain, not once. This was his life now, and he was determined to make the best of it. One afternoon, as Emily rested after a particularly draining treatment, Ethan took Jacob to the park. It was the same park where they had first met, but today it felt different, warmer, more hopeful. The trees were in full bloom, their branches heavy with pink and white blossoms that danced in the gentle breeze. Jacob ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the air as he chased a group of birds that scattered into the sky. Ethan watched him, a soft smile on his face. There was something healing about being outside, surrounded by the simple beauty of nature. It reminded him that despite everything, life went on. The seasons changed, the world kept turning, and with it came the possibility of renewal, of starting fresh. Daddy Ethan, Jacob called out. using the nickname he had come up with on his own. It had started as a way to distinguish Ethan from his friends' fathers, but now it was a term of affection, one that made Ethan's heart swell every time he heard it. "Look, I found a big stick. Can we play swords?" Ethan laughed, nodding as he joined Jacob by a large oak tree. "Of course we can," he said, picking up a stick of his own. "But remember, you have to be careful not to hit too hard. We don't want to break the sticks or each other." Jacob grinned, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'll go easy on you, Daddy Ethan, but I'm still going to win." They began to play, their laughter filling the park as they dueled with their makeshift swords. For a moment, it was easy to forget about the worries that lingered at the edges of Ethan's mind. Here, in this moment, everything was perfect. He had Jacob, he had Emily, and for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As they continued to play, Ethan noticed an elderly man sitting on a nearby bench, watching them with a wistful smile. The man's presence was comforting, a reminder of the continuity of life and the different stages we all go through. Ethan gave him a nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention back to Jacob, who was pretending to be a mighty warrior. After a while, they took a break, sitting down on the grass under the shade of the oak tree. Jacob leaned against Ethan, his small body warm and solid, a tangible reminder of the life they were building together. "Daddy Ethan," Jacob said, his voice soft as he looked up at the sky. "Do you think Mommy's going to get better?" Ethan's heart clenched at the question, and he took a deep breath before answering. "I hope so, Jacob," he said, his voice gentle but honest. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help her, and she's fighting really hard. We just have to keep believing that she'll get better." Jacob nodded, his little face serious as he absorbed Ethan's words. "I believe it," he said firmly, his childlike faith shining through. "Mommy's really strong. She's gonna get better, and then we can all go to the beach like we talked about." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with love for this brave, hopeful boy. "That sounds like a wonderful plan," he agreed. "We'll take a trip to the beach as soon as Mommy's feeling better. We can build sandcastles, swim in the ocean, and eat as much ice cream as we want." Jacob beamed at the thought, his worries momentarily forgotten. "Can we get a dog too?" he asked eagerly. "I want a dog, just like the one we saw on TV." Ethan chuckled, ruffling Jacob's hair. "We'll see," he said, not wanting to make any promises he couldn't keep. But in his heart, he knew that if Emily pulled through, he would do anything to give Jacob the life he deserved, a life filled with love, joy, and the simple pleasures that made childhood magical. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, they headed back to the apartment. Jacob skipped along beside Ethan, his hand tightly clasped in his. The stick he had used as a sword now transformed into a walking staff. When they arrived home, they found Emily sitting up on the couch, a soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked tired, but there was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Did you have fun at the park?" she asked, her voice warm as she watched them enter. Jacob ran to her side, climbing onto the couch to give her a big hug. "We played swords, Mommy," he exclaimed. "And we made a plan to go to the beach when you're all better. And we might even get a dog." Emily laughed, her eyes sparkling with affection as she kissed Jacob's forehead. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," she said, looking over his shoulder at Ethan, her gaze filled with gratitude and love. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." Ethan smiled, his heart full as he walked over to join them. He sat down beside Emily, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as Jacob nestled between them. "I'll always be here for you," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "For both of you." They sat there together as the evening light faded, the world outside their window growing dark. But inside, there was a warmth, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. They had faced so much fear, uncertainty, the weight of the past, but they were still standing, still fighting for the future they wanted to build. Ethan knew there were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear to overcome. But as he held Emily and Jacob close, he felt a deep, unshakable belief that they would get through it. Together they could face anything. And with that belief, the future seemed brighter, filled with possibilities that he had once thought were lost forever. For now, they had each other, And in that simple truth, Ethan found a sense of peace, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The days passed in a blur of routines, but there was a rhythm to them that brought a strange sense of comfort. Ethan had settled into a life he never imagined. One where his mornings began with preparing breakfast for Jacob and ensuring Emily took her medication, and his nights ended with stories and whispered promises of a better tomorrow. The small apartment had become a sanctuary, a place where love and hope intertwined with the realities of illness and uncertainty. One afternoon, while Jacob was at school, Ethan found himself alone with Emily. She was resting on the couch, her eyes closed, the rise and fall of her chest steady but shallow. Ethan watched her from the kitchen, his heart heavy with the knowledge that, despite their best efforts, her condition wasn't improving as they had hoped. Emily must have sensed his presence because her eyes fluttered open, and she offered him a faint smile. "You're staring again," she teased, her voice soft but tinged with affection. Ethan returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I can't help it," he admitted, walking over to sit beside her. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Emily rolled her eyes playfully, but there was a sadness behind her gaze that Ethan couldn't ignore. "I'm a mess, Ethan," she said quietly. "I'm weak, I'm tired all the time. I don't know how you can still look at me like that." "Because I love you," Ethan replied, his voice steady and sincere. "You're still the same woman I fell in love with all those years ago. That hasn't changed." Emily looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, her tone hesitant, "about what's best for you and Jacob, about the future." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, a sense of dread creeping in. "Emily, don't," he said, his voice firm. "Don't talk like that. We're in this together. We're going to fight this." She shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know you want to believe that, Ethan," she whispered, "but we have to be realistic. I'm not getting better, and I don't want you to spend the rest of your life tied to someone who might not make it." Ethan felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of anger and desperation. "Don't say that," he pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not a burden, Emily. You're the woman I love, the mother of my child. I'm not going anywhere." Emily's tears finally spilled over, and she reached out to take his hand, her grip weak but determined. "I need you to listen to me, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "I need you to promise me something." Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening as he prepared himself for what she was about to ask. "Anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If something happens to me," Emily began, struggling to keep her voice steady, "I want you to move on. I want you to find someone else, someone who can give you the life you deserve. And I want you to be happy, Ethan, truly happy." Ethan shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "No," he said firmly, his voice breaking. "I can't promise you that, Emily. I can't imagine a life without you." Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Please," she whispered, "don't let my illness destroy your life. Jacob needs you. He needs a father who's strong and happy, who can give him the world. I want you to promise me that you'll take care of him, that you'll find joy again, even if it's without me." Ethan's resolve crumbled, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared, afraid that if he let go, she would slip away forever. "I love you, Emily," he murmured, his voice thick with tears. "I don't know how to live without you." Emily buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I love you too, Ethan," she whispered. "That's why I need you to do this. For me. For Jacob." They held each other for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their love and the inevitability of what lay ahead pressing down on them. Ethan's mind raced, trying to imagine a future where he wasn't by her side, where he was alone, raising Jacob without her. The thought was unbearable, but he knew, deep down, that Emily was right. He had to be strong. For her, for Jacob, for the life they had built together. Finally, Ethan pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his hands as he looked into her eyes. "I promise," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll take care of Jacob. I'll do whatever it takes to make him happy. But don't ask me to forget you. I'll never be able to do that." Emily smiled through her tears, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "I don't want you to forget me," she said softly. "I just want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." Ethan kissed her forehead, a tender, lingering kiss that conveyed all the love he felt for her. "I'll do my best," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. "For you. For Jacob." They sat there in the quiet of the apartment, the weight of the promise Ethan had made hanging in the air. It was a promise born out of love, a love so deep and selfless that it demanded sacrifice. Ethan knew that the road ahead would be filled with pain and heartache, but he also knew that he would honor Emily's wishes, no matter how difficult it would be. For now, though, they had this moment, this fragile, beautiful moment where they were still together, still a family. And in that moment, they held on to each other, finding comfort in the love that had brought them together and would carry them through whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the room, Ethan made a silent vow to himself. He would cherish every second he had left with Emily, making the most of the time they had. And when the time came to say goodbye, he would find the strength to keep going, to give Jacob the life Emily had dreamed of for him. It was a promise born out of love, a love that would endure no matter what. The following weeks were a delicate dance between hope and resignation. Emily's condition fluctuated. Some days she seemed stronger, her spirit fighting fiercely against the illness that ravaged her body. On others, she was so weak that it took all of Ethan's willpower not to break down in front of her. But through it all, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They would savor every moment, every smile, every quiet conversation, because they knew their time together was precious. One evening, after Jacob had fallen asleep, Ethan and Emily sat together on the couch, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Ethan could sense that something was weighing heavily on Emily's mind. "Ethan," she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan turned to her, his heart tightening at the seriousness in her tone. "You can tell me anything, Emily," he said gently, his hand finding hers. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Emily took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. "Do you remember when we first met in college?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How everything seemed so perfect, like we were destined to be together." Ethan nodded, memories of their early days flooding back. Days filled with laughter, stolen kisses, and dreams of a future that seemed boundless. "Of course I remember," he replied, his voice warm with affection. "Those were some of the best days of my life." Emily smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Ethan couldn't ignore. "There's something I never told you about that time," she said, her voice wavering. "Something I've kept hidden for so long, because I was ashamed." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he remained silent, allowing her the space to speak. "Back then," Emily continued, her voice filled with emotion, "I was struggling. I had dreams, just like you, but I didn't have the confidence to pursue them. I felt like I was always falling short, like I wasn't good enough for you or anyone else. And then, just before graduation, I found out I was pregnant." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of shock and disbelief washing over him. "Pregnant," he echoed, his mind racing as he tried to process her words. "But you never told me. What happened?" Emily looked away, tears spilling down her cheeks as she fought to keep her voice steady. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I was terrified, Ethan. I didn't want to hold you back, to trap you in a life you didn't want. So I made a decision. I had an abortion." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of her confession crashing down on Ethan like a tidal wave. He struggled to find his voice, his emotions a tangled mess of pain, anger, and a deep, aching sorrow. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you let me be there for you? I didn't want you to hate me," Emily whispered, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't want you to see me as weak or selfish. I thought I was doing the right thing, sparing you from a life you weren't ready for. But I've carried the guilt with me every day since. It's haunted me, Ethan. And when I found out I was pregnant with Jacob, I saw it as a second chance, a chance to make things right." Ethan felt his heart shatter at the raw vulnerability in her voice, at the years of pain she had endured in silence. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that he would reject her, that he would walk away from her once again. But instead of anger, all he felt was an overwhelming need to comfort her, to show her that she wasn't alone in this. "Oh, Emily," he murmured, pulling her into his arms. "I'm so sorry you went through that alone. You should never have had to carry that burden by yourself." Emily clung to him, her body trembling as sobs racked her fragile frame. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she cried, her voice muffled against his chest. "I'm so sorry I kept it from you. I was so scared, so ashamed." Ethan held her tighter, his own tears mingling with hers as he stroked her hair, whispering words of comfort. "You don't have to be sorry," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I should have been there for you, should have seen what you were going through. But I promise you, Emily, I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." They sat like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence between them filled with the unspoken forgiveness they both needed. The weight of the past, the pain they had carried alone for so long, began to lift, replaced by a sense of peace that came from finally sharing their deepest fears and regrets. When Emily finally pulled back, her eyes were red and swollen, but there was a lightness in her expression that Ethan hadn't seen in years. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for forgiving me." Ethan cupped her face in his hands, his thumb gently brushing away the last of her tears. "There's nothing to forgive," he said tenderly. "We've both made mistakes, but that doesn't change how much I love you. And it doesn't change the fact that we're in this together." Emily smiled, a small, fragile smile that was nonetheless filled with hope. "I don't deserve you, Ethan," she murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. "You deserve everything," Ethan replied, his voice firm and resolute. "You deserve happiness, love, and a future filled with joy. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have that." As they sat together, the night deepening around them, they knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. There were still challenges to face, still moments of doubt and fear that would test them. But for the first time in a long time, they felt ready to face it all together. The past had been painful, filled with choices and consequences that had shaped who they were. But now, with forgiveness in their hearts and a renewed commitment to each other, they could finally begin to heal, to build the future they had once dreamed of, a future where love and forgiveness would guide them through the darkest of times and lead them into the light. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, twinkling like beacons of hope, Ethan and Emily knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together, with love, with courage, and with the knowledge that they had finally found their way back to each other. The morning after their heart-wrenching conversation, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the small apartment. The heaviness that had lingered for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and quiet resolve. Ethan woke early, the first rays of dawn casting a soft glow through the window, and for a moment, he simply lay there, listening to the gentle rhythm of Emily's breathing beside him. She was still asleep, her face peaceful and free from the lines of worry that had become so familiar. Ethan marveled at the strength she had shown. Through everything, she had remained resilient, determined to protect those she loved. But now, after their night of revelations and forgiveness, she no longer had to carry the weight of her past alone. Ethan carefully slipped out of bed, not wanting to disturb her, and made his way to the kitchen. As he prepared breakfast, his thoughts were a whirlwind of plans and possibilities. The promise he had made to Emily the night before echoed in his mind. He would do everything in his power to ensure she and Jacob had the future they deserved. By the time the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, Emily emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in a soft robe. Her hair was slightly tousled, and there was a hint of color in her cheeks that hadn't been there for weeks. She smiled at the sight of Ethan bustling around the kitchen, a sight that warmed her heart more than words could express. "Good morning," she said, her voice still raspy from sleep, but carrying a note of warmth. Ethan turned to her, a smile spreading across his face. "Good morning, beautiful," he replied, his tone light and affectionate. "I made us breakfast. Thought we could use a good start to the day." Emily walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist as she rested her head against his chest. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." Ethan kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "This is where I want to be. With you. With Jacob. We're a family, and that's all that matters." They ate breakfast together, sharing quiet conversation and soft laughter. The tension that had once defined their days now a distant memory. Jacob soon joined them, his eyes bright with the simple joy of being with the two people he loved most in the world. As they sat together at the table, the three of them, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if this was how it was always meant to be. After breakfast, Ethan surprised them with a suggestion that brought a spark of excitement to Jacob's eyes. "How about we take a trip to the beach today?" he proposed, his gaze shifting between Emily and Jacob. "We've been talking about it for a while now, and I think we could all use a little time by the ocean." Jacob's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? Can we go today?" he asked eagerly, bouncing in his seat. Emily chuckled, her heart swelling at the sight of her son's enthusiasm. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea," she agreed, her eyes meeting Ethan's with a look of deep affection. "It's been too long since we've had a day like that." And so, they packed a small bag, gathering towels, sunscreen, and a few snacks before piling into the car. The drive to the beach was filled with laughter and light-hearted conversation. The tension of the past few months seemingly washed away by the anticipation of a day spent together, free from the burdens that had weighed them down for so long. When they arrived, the sight of the ocean took Ethan's breath away. The sun shimmered on the water's surface, turning it into a vast expanse of sparkling blue. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, a rhythmic melody that seemed to promise peace and renewal. Jacob wasted no time, sprinting toward the water with a delighted shout. Ethan and Emily followed at a more leisurely pace, their hands intertwined as they walked along the sandy shore. The cool breeze ruffled their hair, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea. For hours, they played in the surf, built sandcastles, and collected seashells, their laughter blending with the sound of the waves. Emily, despite her frailty, found herself invigorated by the fresh air and the joy of simply being with her family. She marveled at how something as simple as a day at the beach could bring such happiness, such a sense of normalcy that had been missing for so long. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ocean, they sat together on a blanket, watching as Jacob chased seagulls along the shore. Ethan wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close as they took in the beauty of the moment. "I could stay here forever," Emily murmured, her voice filled with contentment. "Just like this, just the three of us." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple, his heart swelling with love. "Me too," he whispered. "This is what life should be, simple, beautiful moments like this." Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "I don't know what the future holds, Ethan," she said softly, "but I know that as long as we're together, we can face anything." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady and filled with conviction. "We will," he promised. "Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together. You, me, and Jacob, we're stronger than we know." As they sat there, watching the sun sink below the horizon, they knew that this day, this moment, was a new beginning, a chance to build a life filled with love, hope, and the simple joys that made life worth living. The struggles they had faced had brought them closer, had made them realize just how precious their time together was. And as they held each other close, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it with the strength of their love and the unbreakable bond of their family. The sky darkened, and the first stars appeared, twinkling above the ocean like tiny beacons of hope. Ethan, Emily, and Jacob sat in silence, content to simply be in each other's presence, knowing that they had found something rare and beautiful, a love that had endured, that had been tested and had emerged stronger than ever. It was a love that would carry them forward, guiding them through the challenges ahead and lighting the way to a future that was, at last, filled with the promise of peace, joy, and endless possibilities. The days following their trip to the beach were some of the happiest they had ever known. There was a newfound lightness in their lives, a sense of peace that came from knowing they had each other and that they had finally laid the past to rest. But as the weeks turned into months, the reality of Emily's condition became impossible to ignore. She grew weaker, her energy fading despite the best efforts of the doctors and the treatment she endured. Ethan watched helplessly as the woman he loved slipped further away, her once vibrant spirit dimming with each passing day. Yet, through it all, Emily remained strong, stronger than Ethan could ever have imagined. She faced her illness with a quiet courage, determined to make the most of the time she had left. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves outside turned shades of red and gold, Emily asked Ethan to take her to the park where they had first met Jacob. It had become a place of significance for them, a symbol of the unexpected twists of fate that had brought them together and, ultimately, back to each other. Ethan helped her into the car, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be one of the last times they would share a moment like this. They drove in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. When they arrived, Ethan guided Emily to a bench beneath the oak tree where they had first spoken so many months ago. They sat together, watching as Jacob played in the distance, his laughter ringing out like music in the cool air. Ethan wrapped a blanket around Emily's shoulders, his touch gentle, his eyes filled with a love so deep it was almost unbearable. "Thank you for bringing me here," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to see this place one more time, to remember how it all started." Ethan swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I'll never forget that day," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the day everything changed for me. The day I found you and Jacob. The day I found my family." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We've been through so much," she murmured. "More than I ever thought we could survive. But through it all, you never gave up on me. You never stopped loving me." Ethan took her hand, his grip firm but tender. "How could I?" he asked, his voice cracking with the weight of his feelings. "You're the love of my life, Emily. No matter what happens, that will never change." Emily closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his words wash over her. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And that's what's made all of this bearable. Knowing that I have you, that Jacob has you. It gives me peace." Ethan's heart ached as he looked at her, so fragile, yet so filled with grace. "Emily," he said, his voice low and filled with desperation. "I don't know how to let you go. I don't know how to do this without you." Tears finally spilled down Emily's cheeks, but she managed a small, brave smile. "You don't have to let me go," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that trembled beneath it. "I'll always be with you, Ethan. In every moment, in every memory. You'll see me in Jacob's smile, in the way he laughs, in the love we've shared. And when you need me, I'll be there. I promise." Ethan could no longer hold back his tears. He pulled her close, his arms wrapped around her, as if he could protect her from the inevitable. "I love you so much," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll never stop loving you, Emily." "I know," Emily murmured, her voice fading as she rested her head against his chest. "I love you too, Ethan, with all my heart. Thank you for everything." They stayed like that for a long time, the world around them growing still as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The leaves rustled softly in the breeze, and the air was filled with the scent of autumn. In that moment, nothing else mattered, just the two of them, together, holding on to each other with all the strength they had left. Eventually, as the shadows grew longer, Emily's breathing slowed, her body growing limp in Ethan's arms. He felt the life slip from her, felt the warmth of her presence fade, and his heart shattered into a million pieces. But even in his grief, he knew she had found peace, that she had left this world surrounded by the love that had defined her life. Ethan held her for a long time, his tears falling freely as he whispered his final goodbyes. When he finally looked up, he saw Jacob standing nearby, his small face etched with confusion and fear. Ethan reached out to him, pulling him into his arms, holding him close as they both cried for the woman they had lost, the woman who had brought them together, and given them a family. The days that followed were a blur of sorrow and disbelief. The apartment, once filled with Emily's laughter and warmth, felt unbearably empty. But through it all, Ethan clung to the promise he had made, to take care of Jacob, to keep Emily's memory alive in every moment they shared. And so, they began to rebuild their lives one day at a time. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief threatened to overwhelm them, when the weight of Emily's absence was almost too much to bear. But they had each other, and that gave them the strength to keep going. Ethan kept his promise. He took Jacob to the beach, just as they had planned, and they built sandcastles in the sun, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. They adopted a dog, just as Jacob had wished, and named her Hope, a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there was always something to hold on to. And every evening, as the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Ethan would sit with Jacob beneath the oak tree in the park, telling him stories about the mother who loved him more than anything in the world. They would look up at the stars together, and Ethan would remind Jacob that Emily was watching over them, that she was always with them, guiding them through every step of their journey. In time, the pain of their loss began to fade, replaced by the warmth of their memories and the love they had shared. Ethan knew that Emily would always be a part of their lives, that her spirit would continue to guide them as they faced the challenges ahead. And as he watched Jacob grow, as he saw the strength and resilience in his son's eyes, Ethan knew that he had kept his promise, that he had honored Emily's memory in the best way he could. Life went on, as it always does. There were new beginnings, new joys, and new challenges. But through it all, Ethan carried Emily's love with him, a beacon of hope and strength that would never fade. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still and the stars shone bright in the sky, he would close his eyes and feel her presence, a whisper of love that would stay with him always. And so, their story came full circle, a story of love, loss, and the enduring power of the promises we make to those we love. It was a story that would be passed down through the years, a reminder that even in the face of the greatest heartache, love has the power to heal, to unite, and to give us the strength to carry on. For in the end, it wasn't the years they had together that defined them, but the love they shared, the love that had brought them together, that had sustained them through the darkest of times, and that would live on in their hearts forever. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.